Welcome to another edition of Bigfoot's Pad Live. Today we have Tobias Wayland with us, and we're going to be talking about one of his books that he's written called The Lake Michigan Mothman, High Strangeness in the Midwest. I know we've been trying to get different guests on our show. Tobias, of course, wrote a book about a subject that you don't normally hear about very often. So how's everybody doing today?
Doing good.
Doing good?
Mhm.
Okay. Again, looks like our audience is starting to trickle in. It looks like they're on Twitter from what I'm seeing. Um, I guess we'll just jump right into this. So, Tobias, you want to introduce yourself real quick? I know, like I said, you get asked this probably a million times, but can you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what got you started investigating the Mothman and cryptozoology in general?
Sure. Obviously, at this point, people should know my name is Tobias
Mhm.
Wayland, and I am the head writer and investigator for the Singular Fortean Society. The Singular
Mhm.
Fortean Society is an organization that my wife and I started back 2016, and it is primarily an investigative and journalistic organization devoted to all manner of subjects. And so, if somebody's familiar with the word Fortean, it actually comes from Charles Fort, who was an early 20th century collector of news stories. And so, what he would
Yeah.
do is he would collect news stories from all over the world, and he could compile them into these volumes. He would write about them, sort of speculatively. Write about these phenomena and make connections, find commonalities, sort of things like that. One of his most famous quotes is, "One measures a circle beginning anywhere." And so
Yeah.
that is to say that by investigating or researching an area of the paranormal, you can understand something about all of it. Learning about alien abduction might teach you something about ghosts and hauntings, or
Mhm.
cryptids, or vice versa. And that has really formed our approach overall to these subjects.
Yeah.
Because I've certainly found, in not specialized in any one area, that there are a lot of commonalities.
Oh,
So
yeah.
the
Sure.
Definitely.
And
So,
so
yeah.
I guess the other word in the organization that people sometimes get hung up on is singular. And obviously, I know that we're not the only Forteans out there, and I understand that singular can mean one. It can also mean unique or remarkable. And so when we were forming the society, one of the tenets that ended on very quickly was that everybody's opinion is important, every perspective has value, and so really what we were looking for more than anything is a society of singular Forteans, that is to say,
Mhm.
unique or remarkable people who sort of share our holistic view of these phenomena and want to approach things,
Mhm.
in that way. And so we had been doing that for less than a year when
Yeah.
the winged humanoid stuff started happening. So at that point, early in 2017, we decided that we were going to focus on normal news, and so I started writing articles for our website. And in spring of that year, I saw a trio of weird winged sightings come through the Mutual
Mhm.
UFO Network case management system, and they all kind of described these weird winged areas of Chicago, and they seemed awful strange. There wasn't a lot of information about them beyond sort of like the initial witness
Yeah.
report. And I ended up following it with Vaughn. I talked to Sam Moranto, who was the state director for MUFON down there, and
Mhm.
they were never really able to follow up with this witness. I think maybe exchange any of the witnesses. I think they exchanged emails or something. And
Yeah.
and so I had written this short article on it, and I thought that would be it, right? I thought it was one and done. It would just be another one for the crank bell, and we just wouldn't hear anything else about it, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's not what happened. Next thing I knew, there were dozens of reports coming over the next several months. They were primarily coming to the sites, Fan Monsters and UFO Clearinghouse. And at that time, I wasn't really familiar with either of those. So I reached out to a man I've read over at UFO Clearinghouse, and I reached out to Lon Streeter over at Phantoms and Monsters separately to interview them about their work investigating the sightings. And so I'm very forthcoming in terms of being interviewed. I talked to them separately, of course, and then wrote separate articles about interviewing them both. And at that time, they didn't really strike me as having any particular bias toward the hypothesis to explain any sightings or anything. They just were receiving these weird sightings from people. And so it wasn't too long after that, then they realized how close I was, because we just lived in, so really not too far from from help and stuff myself and Emily was my partner the Singular Fortean Society, and so together, we came on board and joined that investigation. And I guess here, it's weird to think about. Almost 6 years later, we're no closer, I guess, to really knowing the truth behind it. But we do still get sightings. So
absolutely, that's the most fascinating part.
So, would you say, for those of our audience that aren't aware really what the Mothman is, could you give like a general description of the creature for the people that don't know really what it is that are listening?
Sure. So generally speaking, in those cases that I think have the highest probability of representing something potentially paranormal, the general description would be a humanoid between 6 or 7 feet tall with a maybe 12 to 15 foot wingspan. People often describe as being very, very dark, even just completely black, and will often describe some sort of glowing eyes, usually red. I've heard orange or yellow or green. And so that's sort of the gist of the descriptions that we get for this thing. There is some variation in that. Some people describe it as bat-like. Some people will describe it bird-like. But in the details, they really match up. And so what I think we're seeing there is more natural variation that you'll see just in people's perspectives, like their perception of it, or trying to relate it to something they know to be able to describe it, And so if the first thing they think of is bat, then they'll say, hey, maybe it's bat-like. First thing they think of is a bird, or if for whatever reason, just that glimpse they got of it reminds them of some, particular animal or some trait of some animal. And that's what they're going to use. But otherwise, generally, it's consistent that way.
So would you say that, I know for our audience members that aren't aware, there was a big sightings flap of something similar to what Tobias was describing in West Virginia in the 1960s. Do you think this creature, would you say it's like the same thing or something really similar? Or in your opinion, what do you think?
Sure. Well, so I held off actually comparing these sightings to the 66 to 67 Point Pleasant, West Virginia flap. And the reason for that was I didn't want to sensationalize anything. I knew in the community that there were certain connotations to that comparison. And I wanted to try to be as objective as possible, but it really got to a certain point where I just couldn't hold off any longer, because quite frankly, they just had too much in common. So at a certain point, it was no longer, or I should say, there was no longer any risk of sensationalizing. It really was just a way to contextualize these sightings for anybody who's interested to them. So, most people, I think, most people in this community, people into weird stuff probably have some, things that they associate with those Point Pleasant Mothman sightings. And that was stuff that we kept, seeing pop, the glowing red eyes, the feeling of stark terror, like even on normal rational fear, feeling as though the eyes were gazing in your soul or being hypnotized, or feeling evil, and then like associated paranormal phenomena. Obviously there are many UFO sightings in these same areas. There were weird humanoid and creature sightings in those same areas. Some witnesses were reporting having other strange paranormal incidents in their own life, either before or more time after the sightings. And so all this stuff, in addition to, of course, the description of this being almost completely identical to what people were reporting back then, that all just sort of added up to, if not being the exact same thing, certainly seeming to be in the same category of thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So would you say there's more sightings in like the Chicago, like the big city type areas, or is it more kind of like in the remote, like farmland, rural areas?
I'd say if we're talking paranormal sightings of something that has the potential to be paranormal in some way, I would say that most of the sightings come from outside of Chicago. Now, I know, especially in 2017 and into 2018, there were a significant number of reports that seemed to come from like downtown.
Yeah.
I will say a lot of those either weren't able to be investigated to my standard. There wasn't enough contact with the witnesses to really follow up on them, or they were probably misidentified birds. And that's something that people should understand about this too, is that there are a significant number of reports that probably represent just a misidentified bird. And I had suspected that for some time, until May of 2018, with sighting that all came together. So in May of 2018, we received a sighting report from a young man in the neighborhood of Chicago. And so he said he was going to work one day. It was in, I think, late morning or early afternoon. The thing is, it was broad daylight out.
Yeah.
And he's bicycling to work. And as he sees a couple on the street corner, and they seem to be looking at something in the sky. And so he looks up and he sees what he later described to me as a giant bat or a person in a wingsuit. And on his bicycle helmet, he's got this GoPro camera. And so he decides he's going to try to follow this thing around, get as much footage of it as he can before he had to get to work. And it was fantastic. And he was very willing to share that footage. He even sent me the SD card that was in his and because it was a GoPro camera, and he got it the footage shot the time lapse, so he could fit more stuff on there. So it was a little difficult. With his help, we were able to identify the object that he had seen, and put it in the Photoshop and really blow it up and take a good look at it. And it was a bird. I mean, it was a bird. There's just no that, and it was probably a pretty big bird. And based on its silhouette, I would guess it could have been something like a great blue heron, which if you've never seen one, they kind of look like pterosaurs. They look like flying. They look strange. If you're not used to seeing them, then yeah, it's possible that misidentifies something else, because I don't think this guy was making anything up. He didn't have anything to gain from this. He wasn't
Absolutely
willing to sell his footage. He really wasn't looking for anything other than help understanding what happened to him. And so, it was interesting to me, because I had found then that, and a lot of people might not know this, Chicago has actually seen a huge influx of herons. And that's largely due to climate change and the destruction of their wetland habitat. What you got is all of these birds roosting in urban environments that might not necessarily do that under normal circumstances, and it's really exploded over like the last decade plus. And so there are probably a lot of city people who are used to seeing stuff who would see these birds, usually during the day, have no idea what we're looking at, and just kind of freak themselves out over it. And so using that, I was able to put together two different sort of sighting templates, really, where I could look at reports as they were coming in and be like, okay, this one is like to be a misidentified large migratory bird or something, and this one is potentially paranormal. Because we were getting, up until that time, I couldn't really reconcile why we were getting these two different report profiles. Like we would get some during the day that really the witness had seen this thing flying and it was always far away and there was nothing else paranormal about it other than that I thought it looked weird. Then you would have these nighttime sightings where people would describe the creature up close, describe it in a way that it just couldn't possibly be any kind of misidentified bird or terrestrial animal. And it took this Pilsen case for me to be able to say, okay, the daytime sightings that match up in pretty much every detail with this Pilsen sighting are probably birds. And most of those, or I should say a lot of those, I don't know most, I have to go back and actually look, a lot of them were the ones coming from more urban areas. And so I think that what we were dealing with was this flux of birds that would have seemed strange to people not seeing that kind of wildlife.
There was another photo from your book I was going to ask you about. It looks like it's like a footprint photo where it shows it looks like a two-toed footprint or a three-toed footprint. It's like towards the back of the book on the Kindle.
Sure. Probably from Woodstock.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That was an interesting one. That would have been probably 2018 or 2019. But there was a man in Woodstock, Illinois, and he was driving home from the Walgreens, of all things. Let's see, that was February 2019. There we go. I just looked it up to be sure.
Yeah.
So, this gentleman was home from buying milk at Walgreens. And, I don't want to dust too much, but this is one of those details that always gets to me, because you find it again in the most credible sightings. People, they're literally going about their business, just living their lives, running errands, doing normal stuff. And then they run headlong to, impossible creature. Right. And, this guy's just driving home. It was late enough in the evening that in February it would have dark out, so he's got his headlights on, and he's passing the Field Pond Conservation Area. And as he does so, he's coming up on the entrance, and he sees this creature, stride out from the entrance in front of him, crosses it in front of his car so he can see it for several seconds in his headlights as he walks in front of him. And then he loses track of, once on the other side of the road, it's sort of in darkness, and it very was gone. Considering too, he's driving forward at like probably 40 to 50 miles per hour. And so he described the thing as sort of being like you would think a Bigfoot would look like, right? So it's large, hairy human with these large leathery wings, So that was a weird sighting. I don't know that it's necessarily of the same thing that other witnesses were reporting in terms of, the quote unquote Mothman phenomenon, but it was in that same area, and it was a weird thing with wings, and so to include it in the general birth of knowledge or lore we had gathered so far. It's really, really interesting sighting because I went down there with Emily, and we met him. We met very wonderful people. Were active in their community down there. They had if unfortunately there is that social stigma, and they really were assisting everything to do that, but it that would take risks to talk to us, just two strangers, invite us down to their home, take us out to this sighting area, show us around everything, when they just had everything to lose by doing so. They weren't getting anything out of it other than, I think, the cathartic sort of release of to talk to someone who actually takes you seriously, because clearly it had an effect on them. Man had seen something. He clearly had been impacted by this experience represents. And obviously his wife took it seriously too. I think she could see the way that it had affected him, and so that made her take it seriously. But they took us out to the sighting area, and it was, by the time we got out there, it was probably early March, and there was still ice and snow everywhere, and so we go into to see the area from where he had seen this creature, and coming, and so we went back there, and we saw a bunch of different bird tracks, because there are some aquatic fowl that do come up pretty. Honestly, since the climate has been warming in general, you see some of those birds that used to kind of they migrate. Or some of them left for winter here under circumstances, which is pretty strange. But so we found some bird tracks. Probably something like egret or a hare or a crane or something similar. Because it had a sort of four-toed, 3 in front and 1 in back, and there were some dog tracks. Looked like maybe somebody had been walking their dog back there, maybe more than a person. And then in this area, toward that entrance, there was just one track, this one print. It was in the ice, and it looked like a bare human footprint, and there was one of them. And it struck me as just the weirdest thing. And the only way, it's the only way we have to actually record this print, just to take a photograph, because you could ask something like that if you wanted to. And so we did, we snapped a photo of it, and I think I have my phone next to it, sort of a size reference. I wear a size 12, and it was way bigger than that. And so, I can't really explain it. It is anomalous. You might think think, maybe somebody was out there banging. They wore those, what do they call them? Those like naked jogging shoes where it's like,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
yeah, the individual toes and everything. And yeah, maybe, I don't know. But that seems weird. It seems like a weird thing to do when there's still snow and ice on the ground, right?
Exactly.
So
yeah.
like, why weren't there more tracks? Why just one? Like, seen so many others that you think, there should have still been, in one prayer. There certainly were areas nearby where somebody was jogging through. They had other prints. So I don't really know how to explain that one. It's just weird.
Yeah.
I
Well,
agree.
I was gonna say, some of these might kind of take a step back. So, do you think Mothman does visit the cities, or do you think that most of those, like you were saying, are misidentified? Do you think that he kind of just, it's not a he, but do you think they stay away from the cities in general then, or?
Well, I couldn't really hazard a guess to the creature if that's what it is, motivation, or what it's doing or why. I will say, I think that if you look through all of the sightings, you'll find most of the ones that are likely to be identified large birds are going to be in urban areas. But that is to say that there aren't any potentially paranormal, winged humanoid sighting in those areas. I've certainly taken some seemingly credible sighting reports from people relatively in areas. I'm reminded of by a Dave Ramos. So David was he's with us, a 9-year veteran of the Chicago Police Force. And when he was a kid back in the early 70s, he was hanging around the north branch of the Chicago River this is a fairly urban area. Nowadays, there's a small university there. Back then, there used to be this weird amusement park thing that had just shut down. And and so they were out there, and his friends were throwing concrete into the river from this construction site, and he didn't feel comfortable doing it. So he stayed up on and so he's hanging around while his friends are doing that. He's just kind of messing around, waiting for them to be done. And he sees this man, I guess, down the trail somewhat, and thought initially a person wearing like a cape or something, because it had something seemingly sort of like wrapped around it like that. And he said at first he thought that they were wearing some kind of goggles, right? Like some kind of red tinted goggles, until this thing, spread his cloak out, and it turned out to be wings, and realized those goggles were actually eyes, and it sort of takes off and flies away like through these.
Wow.
And he's freaked out, and he goes to his friends, and he sees if anybody's seen the person they were all messing around down by the river, so they didn't see it. But it was something that they're really, really, unlike many witnesses, he didn't really talk about it, especially later in his life when he was a police officer. I mean, that's not the kind of thing that you're going to talk about. Like, it's going to ruin your entire career,
Exactly.
And so he sort of just kept it with him. And it wasn't until much later when he found me. I think he had read one of my articles or something similar, that he felt comfortable forward, because most of the people, what it is, and this was the same with him. When he told friends about it, they made fun of him, and of course they hadn't seen anything, so and he just never talked about it. And they found somebody like me. What usually happens is people will have this impossible experience, and they want to talk about it. We're human beings. We're social. That's how we do things, right? and they'll go to a loved one, could be a close friend, could be a spouse, a parent, a sibling, whatever. And the most common reaction is get laughed at, and then they don't want to talk about it, and they just do it to themselves until hopefully someday they find somebody like me, and they can get test. And so that was David's story, more or less, is that just he didn't know that there was anybody else who had seen anything like this, one. And then two, he didn't realize that there was anybody who was ever going to take him seriously if he told this story.
So he felt comfortable.
Yeah.
And actually, and I'm sorry to interrupt you. There's a guy that keeps asking me to ask you a question here.
Yeah.
So one of our viewers wants to know: has there ever been any remote viewing sessions or psychic contact with any of these creatures?
Well, I can't say definitively if that's ever happened. Sort of by the nature of parapsychological phenomena, right? Where I mean, we don't even know 100% if it's I don't know 100% if it's real or not, because certainly people seem to experience, but it's not the kind of reliable thing. It's easily to be true, I guess. And so, I guess to answer the question, though, there have been some claims of psychic contact, and those claims might be true on some level. It might at least be true in the sense that the person claiming the contact really believed that had it. I've never seen anything that would convince me that they are empirically true, in the sense that it's undeniable. And not much has actually come from of that claimed contact. I think the most credible sort of parapsychological phenomenon that would be associated with sightings would be the sense of evil that people feel, which would be some kind of psychic sense. And I think the sense of feeling like they are sort of being stared to, which might also represent some sort of psychic connection. In terms of credible psychic relationships and sustained communication, I haven't seen anything to convince me that that's been happening in any very credible way.
One thing I was wondering, it's kind of on the same subject. I know when you talk, well, not you specifically, but when you hear about the West Virginia Mothman sightings, some people kind of compare it to like a spiritual creature or kind of like a ghost. I don't know if that's what the viewer was talking about, or do you know if there's any kind of stories kind of like that with the Lake Michigan Mothman?
Sure. I think that those kinds of hypotheses surrounding the being or origin are natural when you consider the baffling circumstances of sightings, right? Where people will describe this as seemingly coming out of nowhere, disappearing in. They will describe things that are physically, seemingly impossible, like taking off without flapping its wings, or really just the overall construction of this being. Right? It should be impossible for it to fly. Like if you had something that's my size, I'm 6'2". If I had a 12-foot wingspan, those wings would just be for show. I wouldn't be able to fly. It would be physically impossible for this thing to fly, period. And yet here we are with people saying that they've seen it. And so I think under those circumstances, it's only natural for people to speculate about some kind of supernatural origin or nature to
Yeah.
to these things. And I mean, it's as good of an explanation as anything at this point. I'm generally more comfortable discussing what I think it's not than what I think is. So I'm pretty comfortable saying that, like, I don't think it is undiscovered animal species, just for the reason already mentioned. It doesn't seem like it should be able to exist if it was just some normal animal. So, but yeah, that's something that people have been talking about pretty much for the entirety of these sightings.
We're being asked a question to ask you. I'll put it up on the screen. So it's kind of like a two-parter, though. The first part of the question, they said, have you ever heard of a creature called Bat Squatch? And can he say it may be the same creature? And then the other part of the question, he says, do you think, as far as the Mothman of Lake Michigan goes, like that area, he says, do you think it could be an interdimensional being?
So I have heard of that. Sure, it's rare, but not heard of course, for people to describe hairy foot-esque beings that have these sort of large, in fact, are very what the Woodstock described. That specific witness in might be the same sort of entity as people who have described this that come to me as that's absolutely. Do that is something that could directly compare all of the Michigan Mothman sites to? No, I definitely don't, because that Woodstock sighting was a real outlier. There had been very many of these humanoid sightings around Lake Michigan, and it's not just Chicago or even just Illinois. Wisconsin, Indiana, even some up in Michigan proper. And so, yeah, I mean, it's well, they're rated in the sense that we're getting some of these sightings in the same general geographic area that are similar or related to what you might call a bat squatch, but I don't think it's a good explanation for everything, or even for both sides. And in terms of I mean, it's a hypothesis that we can entertain. I'm willing to entertain that, especially considering what people describe. I mentioned earlier, especially when people talk about saying sort of appearing and disappearing seemingly at will. Now, I want to make sure we're all on the same page when we talk about interdimensional, because sometimes people use the word interdimensional when what they really mean is parallel universe. But when I think of an interdimensional being, I think of a being that is to more actual dimensions than us. So if we think of our three physical dimensions with which we can interact, right? What would it be like if there were a being that existed and interacted with, 5, 6, 7, who knows? How many dimensions more than us? What would they be able to do, right? And so one of the easiest ways to conceptualize this, I think, is to think about what it would be like for us to interact with a two-dimensional creature, right? So like I've got a two-dimensional, and so it's basically flat, it's in 2 dimensions. But here I am, a 3-dimensional creature, so I can do crazy stuff compared to this thing right now. I can pop into and seemingly disappear from this thing's reality, and it would seem like magic, but to me, I'm literally just doing the easiest thing in the world to me, right?
Yeah.
This two-dimensional being, would be seeming, appearing, and disappearing at will. And perhaps even more frighteningly, it would never even be able to see all of me. It would only be able to see the part of through the dimensions that it actually perceive. And so if you're using interdimensional that way, then I mean, maybe a lot of paranormal stuff is that, because it certainly seems to interact with us in a way that would imply that kind of ability, really. And so, yeah, I definitely entertain that, as terrifying as that should seem to people, because the aspect of that, if you've got this two-dimensional being, right? Like, here I am in this third dimension that it just can't perceive at all. Like, it just doesn't exist in it. Now it's going about its life, and it thinks that it can see everything. It is the master of its domain. But here I am. I can see it fine. And if I choose to interact at any time, I will. And there's nothing it can do about it at all. And it doesn't even know that. It's unable to perceive that on any level. If you're some kind of interdimensional creature, then that's what it is. And that should be terrifying.
So I was going to get into this in just a minute, but it looks like we're getting another question from the same person in the chat. They're wanting to know if you could talk about how some people think it might be like a thunderbird or a giant. You said some of them are kind of owl-like in your book.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are. If you want to talk owl-like, I think a lot of that comes from some of the reports in the Hispanic community down in Chicago, when they will compare this thing to this folkloric being called the Yakuza. And so this thing is supposed to be a witch who can turn into either an owl or an eagle, and it's sort of this folkloric shape-shifting character. And I don't know that we should interpret sightings to mean that what they're literally just is this shape-shifting witch, so much as seems to be the best way for them to relay their experience. Because what you'll find is folklore, they'll use pop culture. A lot of people will try to compare it to something they saw in a movie, because what they're actually doing is so far outside of their understanding. It's difficult for people to really have the means to describe what they saw. And so I think the owl-like attribute sometimes is just another instance of what I was talking about before, with people sort of alternating between bird-like and bat-like in describing this thing. And I don't think we should read much more into it other than that necessarily. I mean, not without more stronger evidence to sort of like point us in the direction of a conclusion there. I will say, I also there where somebody's talking about eagle, similar large birds. They are huge, and maybe that does account for some of those misidentifications. We do have eagle. If you're talking about large predatory birds in Chicago, there are a lot of peregrine falcons, a whole lot. They were actually introduced into the city to vermin. I think specific. I don't remember what it was. I think they wanted something about like the pigeons or something. I would have to look it up. Don't necessarily quote me on that. Actually look that up before you tell anybody else. But there are a ton of peregrine falcons in Chicago, and so the sighting could be them. They're not as big as say a sand crane or a great blue heron or something, but they're big enough. And if you saw it up close, or within some kind of like relatively short distance, I'm sure it would seem huge. So caught yourself. I think that some of those sightings that fit the identified bird profile, that it could be something a peregrine falcon or similar. Sure.
So the next question, I know your book only mentioned one. You said someone in the chat also wants to know. There was a part of your book where you said that someone compared it to a pterodactyl, or there was like a pterodactyl sighting.
Yeah. So, and
about
this
that
is
for the
another
audience?
case of I always like to err on the side of including too much rather than excising something that might actually be potentially useful. And so I did include almost, just every weird winged creature sighting that had been received from many sighting areas. And so there were a couple of pterosaur sightings. There were a couple individually that came from, it was I believe Gary, Indiana, and actually it was a man in life, and kind of an interesting story where this man had seen what he described as a pterosaur, well, very similar to what most people would think of as like a pterodactyl. Although what most people think of as a pterodactyl now, I think most paleontologists would say is woefully incorrect. But that sort of beside the point. He had seen this thing with like a huge wingspan. It had to be, I think it was like dozens of feet of this thing's wingspan. And then he went on and told wife she didn't believe him. She laughed at him, but then she saw it, and then she came home and was like, "Well, yes, you were right," And so it was related directly to the sort of Mothman sightings prop, again, they select the associated paranormal phenomena. Again, like you don't have the weird stuff that people sometimes talk about. You don't have eyes. You don't have the fear, the being hypnotized. You don't have the sort of opposition to known physics or biology. They're weird enough where if what the people are describing is accurate, and it couldn't be any sort of normal animal. And so you start thinking, I think, about certain possibilities where these things could line up. Are there certain areas where time slips are more likely? Are there certain areas where where our universe is intersecting with some kind of parallel universe? Where either a Mothman entity could come through, or you would see into a parallel universe where dinosaurs never went extinct, and so you still have these giant flying dinosaurs. And so I think they could be related in that way. If there is some sort of environmental quality that is at least partially for these sightings.
One more thing I was going to say, because I was kind of trying to go over like the basic descriptions of like the different ways of people compared the creature. Was it Rock Island, Illinois, where you were in your book? You said that there was one that was kind of described as a gargoyle that was sitting on top of a light pole.
Oh boy, good question. I do know what you're talking about. I'm trying to remember. Let's see. There's a flying gargoyle near Hoffman State. I don't think that's.
I want to say it was like Iowa or Rock Island or somewhere around there.
Let me see. So we've got. Oh, yep. Rock Island and Naperville. Okay. So actually two people around the same time, I think, who reported these. Okay, so yeah, this one, the one I'm thinking of, came into Fans and Monsters, and it was Rock Island back in 1997. So, this is 160 miles west of Chicago, over by that Illinois-Iowa border. And we had actually mentioned Rock Island earlier when we were talking before the show. So, let's see here. This was one. Just going over the report now. No, this is one that was taken by law, so I didn't have of involvement in this.
Yeah.
But, yeah, it was a witness who, let's see, they were out and they looked up and on top of a streetlight, yeah, across the street from their house. They saw this figure with red eyes, seemed to be looking at them, and it was sitting there and reportedly had huge wings. So the person's on foot, but now they ran out to the car, get something, see this bizarre gargoyle, and ran back in. And they tell their mother about it, and then their mother says something like something to the effect of that ain't nothing but the devil after your expletive. And so they were understandably scared. And I mean, that's about the end of the sighting. That's a weird one to me. Long to talk to this person, and they sort of went over the story and reiterated what they had written to him. But there are so many questions that I would have. Like you walk out.
Oh yeah.
You see this thing, right? And then you run back inside, which is normal. But but then that's the end of it, really? Like no other action taken.
Yeah, that's kind of weird. Yeah, you would think if it's just sitting on the light pole, you would either want to take a picture, or you would be at least watching it for quite a while. You would think.
Yeah.
Yes.
I know. I like your take on when people ask. This question is going to be coming up. Why aren't there a lot of photos of the creature? I like your take on this. If you could explain that real quick to the audience. Yeah.
I mean, I even get my phone. I'll take a to do something. Most of the time, this is happening so fast, and people are in such a state of shock or disbelief or fear that they don't even think to take their phone out and do anything. In those instances where they do, those are largely the misidentified bird sighting that I was talking about previously. So, yeah, I mean, it's not that easy in the to actually get your phone out and take a picture of something that only lasts for several seconds. It's just not. And beyond that, your phone isn't really made to capture that kind of motion. It's not. Like your phone is designed to be able to like take cool selfies, at national parks and stuff. There are objects, set up photos, like it's not for like, sports photography or anything where you have to be able to catch something moving very, very quickly. And so it's more difficult than people think. And like I said before, like the analogy that I like to use is getting my phone out fast enough to capture one of our pets doing something cute. It's really hard. I almost never manage to do it. And so you can only imagine how difficult it must be to capture a picture of some kind of terrifying, impossible entity, from your very nightmares that has appeared out of nowhere when you least suspect it. So I would ask anybody who is necessarily skeptical of that to just really honestly ask themselves, like, how easy is it for them really to be able to very quickly take a photo of that, or just natural wildlife in general? Like it's not that easy, difficult, honestly.
So, I have a couple of notable sightings I was going to mention. A couple of these, and I have some questions that are kind of randomized. So there was a story on, I believe it was in your book or it was on Seth Breedlove's documentary, where it said that there was a hunter that actually shot at one on a dam or a reservoir.
Oh, okay.
That was towards the beginning of your book, I think it was.
Yeah, that was another one. Boy, where was that?
I want to say it was like a dam or a reservoir or something. Someone was walking around by one.
Yeah, I think it was. I think it was a dam because there was Prairie Creek Reservoir,
Mhm.
and there were some sightings about that. It might be Goshen Dam, and I don't know if I'm saying that right or not.
Yeah.
In Indiana. Let me see here. Yeah, I think this is the one. We're okay. Yeah, that's the one you're thinking of. So this is another
they're
one
saying,
on. Goshen Dam in Indiana, summer of 2000. Let's see, a couple friends were out hanging out at this dam. They just take a walk out there at night. It was a full moon, so like it was relatively well lit, and they hear the rumbling, like rocks moving, and
Mhm.
and then they hear this whoosh, and so they compare it to sort of like the whoosh you hear from a pterodactyl in a Jurassic Park movie, which
Yeah.
is an example of people trying to use any available resources to describe their experience. And they see the outline of it in the moonlight. So they didn't think it was a bird or anything. It honestly very easily could have been some kind of large bird that just scared them. But what they said,
Yeah.
what they found really, really scary about it was after they heard that, they heard the loud bang, like somebody was shooting at it. So they got the heck out of there, right? And so they get back to their friend's house and they hear police sirens. So yeah, boy,
Yeah.
who knows when it comes to that? I will say, boy, there's a lot to unpack, I guess. So you've got this creature. It's very, very dark out. Walking by moonlight. You hear this whoosh. They see the large flying thing that they don't think was a bird, but how could you possibly know under those circumstances? And they hear what they thought somebody shooting at it. I mean, they could have misidentified that sound. It could have been something else. They thought it was a gunshot. It could have been a gunshot that was unrelated. Maybe there was a crime taking place relatively near, and that's why the police came. Certainly, I think it's a relatively fair assumption to think the arrival of the police is probably related to hearing gunshots, right? Like one would hope, right? But otherwise, there's not a lot to take away from that. It is one of those rare nighttime sightings that I think could very easily be a misidentified bird. Largely, again, because it lacks all of the associated paranormal qualities that we have come to see in the most credible, potentially anomalous sightings. I mean, there's so many of those, and they were contribute to sort of mythology that was around these sightings. That was big. That was a big part of why I felt like that book needed to be written, especially when it was written, because you had all of these things and they're being treated equally, which I didn't think was fair. I want people to be able to look at each sighting individually and see what had actually gone into in investigating it, and then be able to judge how credible that sighting was. Because frankly, a sighting like that is not comparable to a David Reynolds sighting, or that Woodstock sighting, or any of the other things that just couldn't possibly be in kind of normal animal, assume that this is authentic relating their story. I always do, unless I have kind of credible evidence to support the idea that they are not, and so it's important to me that people have resource they can look at to be like, okay, so I've heard about this sighting. Now, how should I take it? And in the case of that particular sighting, probably not super seriously, honestly. It doesn't seem particularly impactful or important to the in investigation with the information that we have on it currently. You know, if somebody could blow the doors off it with some new info that made it seem really weird, that would be great, and be open to that. But as it is, who knows?
So the next one I was going to say is there was a story about, I want to say it was a Hispanic neighborhood over in Chicago where the creature was on the hood of someone's car. It was like a couple. In regards to that story, do you think the creature might be dangerous? Because it almost sounded like it was stalking those people.
Sure. So yeah, there was a park in Village. I think that you're referring to, and so this couple claimed that had gone to this park to spend some time together, and they said that this thing had sort of landed on the hood of their car, and seemed threatening. And that was one of those cases where there wasn't a lot of follow-up. I certainly was not able to corroborate most of the details. So I have a hard time. Now this is sort of similar to the misidentified bird problem, where it's difficult to reconcile that sighting with the more credible sightings, because I think if somebody was going to be hurt, like actually hurt, they would have been hurt by now. Certainly in that case, if what you're saying is absolutely true and that did happen, then it probably could have hurt them if it actually wanted to. The one thing I will say is I did receive what I would consider a far credible report just north of Chicago of a who was out one night to meet his friend in a parking lot to jumpstart his friend's car. His friend's car, the battery was dead, and so this guy goes out to meet him. Jumpstart his car for him. This was back in the 70s. And while he's out there, he's getting ready to jumpstart his friend's car, and he feels suddenly very, very afraid, like this unnatural sense of fear. And so he starts looking around, trying to pinpoint the source of this. Like he suddenly feels so scared, and he looks around and he sees this thing on top of this silo nearby, this weird black winged humanoid with these glowing red eyes. This thing swoops down at him, and decided to just hightail it out of there. And he said, well, I should say his daughter. This was related to me by his daughter, as he had since passed. And he had later told her then that this thing had tried to attack their car while they were leaving, and he said that she had a 13-year-old, relatively young, but enough to like this, had actually been able to go out there and see the damage that it had done to the car and see these scratch marks. And so that's a very credible sighting in terms of pointing to some actual phenomenon. So it does make me wonder, maybe there's something to that little thing, but there just hasn't very much. There just hasn't been very much contact with those witnesses convince me that they are credible. But like I said, who knows?
Have you ever heard stories of the Mothman over in like the Michigan area eating dogs or cats like they did in the Point Pleasant sightings? Like, do you ever hear of anything like
that? At the same time, did it do that in the the Point Pleasant sightings, like if you go back and reread the Mothman Prophecies by John Keel. I love his writing. He's a very, very entertaining writer. He is. One about Keel that people need to understand, though, is that he never let the truth get in the way of a good story. He just didn't. And that's part of why books were so popular. They were like reading fun pulp adventure stories, straight up like Amazing Stories magazine. And even when you go back and read that book, what was there, like one dog, really? It's the kind of thing that like he would include because it was weird, and I don't blame him for that, because I probably would have too. But it doesn't exactly point to a pattern. You know what I mean? It's not like people were like, "Oh man, dozens of dogs are going missing in the area around Point Pleasant." It's like one dog. So, there probably were dogs that have died, and I can blame Mothman for that if people want. But I don't think that it's much to do, with that particular German Shepherd or whatever in Point Pleasant.
So I'm trying to look at my notes. Has anyone ever seen more than one of the creatures at the same time? Do you know, or anyone's ever seen multiple creatures?
Somebody reported seeing more than one. Let me see. There's a woman who was in Illinois, and now I'm trying to remember when this was. It was, I know her sighting was 2021. Just out there we go. I took this report and see. It didn't make it into the Lake Michigan Mothman book, but I believe it is in Strange Tales.
Yeah.
And so this one talks about basically seeing 4 winged humanoids flying over her house in 2001. And so basically, as she related to me, she's 2001, her backyard in Berwyn. So she had a picnic with her family. It was over, and people were inside cleaning up. It was about 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And as she was in the backyard, sort of cleaning up and stuff inside, she looked up and she saw these. She described them as 4 humongous men that were all black, that had big wings, like really, really big wings, and they had these glowing eyes. And she thought that when she looked at them, like they seemed to look back at her, and she just lost it. She started to cry, in fact, because she was so scared, because these things seemingly had noticed her, and in doing so, she wasn't sure where it would lead. And so terrified, she starts crying and runs inside. And when she did, her cousin went in there and sort of asked her what was wrong, which she said she was so afraid she couldn't even speak.
Yeah.
And so she wanted to decide to make sure they were gone, and they were, and she never saw them after that. And what's interesting about this sighting, and one that you see so many that I've seen over and over again, really, is that fear, and then what that tends to do to people, like she didn't really talk about this much until she saw, I think it was Terror in the Skies, which was the other Small Town Monsters documentary that I've been. And after watching that, she decided to reach out to me and tell her story. But that fear can sort of manifest itself in many ways, for this woman it was a temporary thing, luckily, where she was just overpowered in the moment. But for some people, it makes them never talk about it again. Like there are witnesses with whom I've spoken that will describe feeling as though they are terrified to talk about their sighting, because if they do, they're going to make this thing like they're scared to talk about it, because I think it will invite this entity back into their life, and they're really, really, really afraid of that happening, and so they're just very, very reluctant, to discuss it.
So let's see. So this one's a question that I'm actually being asked by my daughter sitting over here off the screen. She wants to know, what was it? She wants to know if you've ever seen a Mothman yourself, is what she's saying.
No, that is a perfectly fair question, and I have not. I would love to, and I would love to tell you about it if it ever happens. No, I haven't seen any one of these winged creatures personally.
She's also asking. She's also asking, what do you think it is? Like personally, like what do you think it is?
Sure. Well, like I said, I'm much more comfortable talking about what I think it's. So, I don't think that it is a hoax, or at least not entirely a hoax. I think that the people with whom I've spoken personally are relating their experiences to me authentically. And so I take them seriously. I think that they've definitely seen something. And what they've seen has been very impactful to their lives. So some of them have seen misidentified large birds, but others have seen things that, if you believe the testimony, could possibly be something like that. And so at that point, you have to be open to a myriad of strange possibilities, which I am. But I couldn't definitively say it's one thing or another right now, because we just don't know enough about the paranormal or any of these phenomena to say with the assurance what any of them are. So I hate that answer, and I get that it's not super satisfying, so sorry, but it just is what it is.
So we'll probably go on for about 15 more minutes. So I'm trying to look at some questions we're getting real quick. So on Facebook, a question that I got asked yesterday, actually, to ask you. So your book kind of mentions a little bit about UFO encounters in your Lake Michigan Mothman book. So are UFOs heavily involved with the Mothman over in Lake Michigan? Like John Keel says they were kind of tied together, or at least he made them tie together, however you want to word that, over in the Point Pleasant area?
Sure. Well, just like in the Mothman prophecies, the only connection really to UFOs in the Point Pleasant sightings is that they sometimes happen to be seen in the same areas. So in that sense, yes, absolutely. There are a lot of UFO sightings in these same areas. Sometimes the witnesses themselves will have UFO sightings. I've talked to several witnesses who have had UFO sightings as their Mothman sighting. And so there is the same kind of connection that we saw in Point Pleasant, which is a geographic one, where they do tend to be reported in these same areas, sometimes by these same people who have seen the winged creature itself. So and it's at the risk of repeating myself. It's the same kind of connection, but it's a tenuous one, in that there's no direct connection. It's not like anybody has ever talked about seeing Mothman piloting a flying saucer or anything. It's just not that level of interaction.
Mm-hmm. So, this one. Sorry, these questions are kind of all over the place, kind of randomized.
No, that's great. Keep me at my.
So I saw the Small Town Monsters one on the Lake Michigan Mothman. I don't know if you've ever been asked this before. I kind of struck a chord with me towards the end when Seth Breedlove said that he thought that either you were hoaxing some of the stories or he didn't believe you. I kind of, I don't know, it didn't sit well with me. I was wondering, what do you think about that when, like, I don't know if skeptics say that, or I don't know if you have an opinion on what he said, or.
I don't remember. Seth and I always get along really well, and so I don't remember him saying that about me specifically.
Yeah.
I think he may have been referring to some sites that I didn't personally investigate.
Yeah.
And so that was fair enough to me. Like, I covered every single sighting. But at the same time, just sitting down with you, I've made it pretty clear that not all of these sightings are all that credible in terms of having even strong witness testimony that you point at and be like, hey, if nothing else, this is a real person who really had some kind of experience.
Oh yeah.
And so that didn't bother me so much because people can believe whatever they want, and I don't blame people for believing almost anything if there isn't strong evidence to the contrary. In terms of that specific documentary, I was completely, I guess, satisfied with where it ended up in, because of the kinds of things that they felt like they had included in it. But I understood that there were a lot of politics involved at that time, and that I think feeling a lot of pressure to include a lot more of, like, say, and those guys than me. I would have personally, nothing against them at all, but their with actual Lake Michigan investigation was very, very minimal. So I think that Seth was just sort of pressured to include them more because there were people who had frankly, they were just didn't on very much, and I don't think they liked Manuel. Maybe they didn't like very much, and so they pressured him to include something to counter anything that any sort of narrative they thought we were going to bring to this story, which is unfortunate because anybody who thinks that I'm bringing a strong narrative has not interacted with my work at all. Because I very much try to avoid those kinds of biases in my work and how I present it. I love to speculate about stuff. All manner of possibilities, but I try to be as objective as possible when actually examining evidence. But yeah, I mean, it just sort of was what it was at that point. Unfortunately, this field is sort of rife with drama and there are a lot of people who get into it to be entertainers and they want to be celebrities, and if they're not able to do that through the quality or popularity of their work, then they will try to do it through any means possible, and that can include starting to gain attention through just being contentious, unfortunately. And so I think a lot of that was affecting that video or that particular production at that time. But like I said, it just sort of what it is. I don't have any hard feelings Seth or Heather or anybody others actually of mine. And I sort of understood that they were doing they kind of had to do it. But there are other productions. I'm actually working on a production right now. I'm not sure how, but it'll be on television. I think it's going to be a much more faithful
Yeah.
adaptation, or I guess it'll cover the investigation in a way that I've sort of always wanted to be covered, minus all of the attention seeking and celebrity wannabe BS, just all of it removed, and just focusing on the actual witness experiences and things. And so I'm pretty excited about that, and that'll be shooting relatively soon this year, and hopefully it'll come out not too long after that. And I'll talk about it as soon as I can, and let everybody know and where they can see it. But I think it'll be a much more objective look at the actual investigation, without all the other nonsense that's sort of been getting in the way, thanks to some rather large egos.
Oh, yeah. So this question's asked by our chat room again. They wanted to know, do you think Mothman might be an alien?
Sure, maybe. I guess it's what you think of an alien. Now, we were talking about interdimensional before, right? Is that an alien? It's not native to Earth, so sure, probably. Do I think that it's alien in the sense that it likely could be from outside of our reality, or from a place other than Earth or something? Sure. Assuming that it is some sort of paranormal entity or something similar, then yeah, I would really say that it's alien in that kind of, as extraterrestrial being.
Yeah.
Some like that. I kind of think that's less likely, between Mothman phenomenon and the phenomenon to really back up. I don't even know if the UFO phenomenon has anything to do with extraterrestrial or physical spaceship, anything like that. So that's logical leap number one. And then logical leap number two, to get to Mothman as an extraterrestrial, is how to connect it in a very strong way to the actual UFO phenomenon. And it's just not further than this being stated in the same general area as those. But so was a lot of other stuff. There are plenty of haunted houses in areas known for UFO sighting, and I think that it would not necessarily be the most rational leap to decide that ghosts are aliens, right? So, I mean, who knows? Fundamentally, I guess they could. But I don't know that. I guess that's not the most powerful possibility. It doesn't seem like a very strongly.
Yeah. So we have about 10 minutes left in the show. So one of my last questions I had, we kind of talked about this a little bit before the show started. So do you still collect sighting reports on the creature, or do you have any that have come in somewhat recently? And are you done with the Mothman, or you think you're going to still put out more books and things in the future? Could you talk about that?
I'll continue to cover this as long as people are reporting sightings. The last one that I took personally was from June 20th of 22. So this is less than 1 year ago. It was a woman, Shayna Clipper, who decided to go on the erect. I love, and I really appreciate when people are willing to that. I get why people aren't, but for anybody who does, I think that's fantastic. And so Shayna was outside with her mom, Brooke. Again, this is in Rockford, so maybe 45 minutes north of Chicago. They're outside of Shayna's apartment building, and it was pretty late. It was about 1 a.m. And they hear this screech. And so Shayna hears this screech, I think, first, and she turns her head towards the direction of it. And there's this creek that sort of runs by her apartment. It's, maybe half a block away or so. And between her parking lot and this creek is another parking lot that's empty. And then you've got this creek, there's a little walking path next to everything. And so she looks over when she hears this screech, and she sees this huge black shape, right? This silhouette. And of course, when she looks over, and then her mom sees that she's looking over, and so she looks over, and she sees that same thing. And at first, it's just sort of this big black blob, right? You described it as being roughly the size of the dumpster in her parking lot. And then it spreads these wings, and it takes flight, and it flies along this tree line along the creek there, and they lose sight of it. So obviously they're pretty good to have seen this thing, and food. And calls up her roommate, tells her to bring some flashlights, things, and they're going to go look for this thing. They go all the way down to the nearby park, and they don't see it. It's gone. And they get back, and the roommate, well, whatever. I didn't even see this thing. I'm going to go to the gas station, and I'm going to come back, and I'm going to go to bed.
Oh yeah.
While she is gone, Shayna and her mom are still standing outside, and see. So they walk down to this sort of broken down fence thing that sort of separates her lot from this other one, or it might have been, but the other lot of the creek. And so they're walking along that, and they see this weird glowing. It was difficult for Shayna to describe this, and again, I understand that completely, because it's just so weird, that it was difficult for her to sort of get the words what they were seeing. But it was this glowing UFO, and the best she sort of described it as was like sort of solid light, like it was made out of light, right?
Yeah.
It sort of materialized out of seemingly nowhere, and just started flying around in this graceful pattern, and described the way that it moved as a swinging manta ray. And it almost had this sort of like undulating movement, and it was very slow, and it looked very thin, and it wasn't there for very long. It was always sort of at the same general height, and it sort of vanished, right? And she didn't think that it could be anything like any sort of light reflected off of clouds. And of course, I went and I checked the data for that. There were no clouds, even if there was some spotlights that was shining around it 1:30 in the morning. They were waiting for it to actually bounce off to recreate that effect. It wasn't really wind. So the likelihood of it being a boon or a bag or any kind of debris or anything being blown around is very, very likely. It's just unexplained, It's anomalous. It is a sort of a reflective of the types of UFO sightings that we get surrounding these winged humanoid sightings. They aren't often the kind of UFO sightings that are reminiscent of or indicative rather of any kind of physical craft. You just get weird UFO sightings, strange solid light, craft or entities flying around things like that. So yeah, it was relatively recent, and it's a really exciting in terms of the actual witnesses and their
Oh yeah.
willingness to put themselves out there for it. And it includes a weird UFO sighting. So there's still plenty of high strangeness happening surrounding this, and you even mentioned it in my book. There's a neat ending to this, like there's no wrap up, there's no climax to the story where everything just sort of wraps up afterward. I think that we'll always get these sightings, and there's just never going to be any end to it, and maybe if we're lucky, we'll slowly begin to understand more about these phenomena over time.
Yeah.
But who knows? For my part, I'll continue covering them as we keep getting them. I don't specialize in any one area. I've investigated ghosts and hauntings and UFOs, all manner of cryptid monsters, parapsychological phenomena, all of that stuff. So this is sort of interesting in that it tends to include much of those phenomena. So, but yeah, here we
So
are.
one last thing I would like to say. So is there any kind of links? I know I've been posting your website throughout the show. Could you tell us a little bit about any kind of links that you would like the audience to know, or any kind of projects? I know you kind of mentioned one that you were doing.
Oh, sure. So, if you want to keep up with what we're doing at the Singular Fortean Society, of course, you can always go to singularfortean.com, which is our website. Also follow us on social media. We're on pretty much everything, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and all, at Singular Fortean. So it's very easy to find. I do have that television project that in the works. Like I said, I can't talk right now, but it is very, very exciting, and I think people will find it very, very interesting. So look at that later, and if you follow us, you will hear more about it as soon as I can talk about it. I am working on my third book right now, which is Peace of Societies. You will tie to high strangeness, which sort of ties together all sorts of holiday folklore with more modern day paranormal and experiences, which I think people will be interesting. And also we're constantly going and investigating things, and, writing about them, and really trying to cover this weird world and all of the weird news in it. So certainly, if people are interested in that, I think that they would probably.
Oh yeah. Thanks for joining us on the show again. I know we're definitely once your film project comes out, we'll have to have you back on the show. We are getting a lot of questions on like our Facebook and our Twitter still. Again, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We'll have to have you back on the show.
Yeah, thank you.
Check out Tobias Wayland's website, singularfortean.com. I'll also post it in the show description in case anybody wants to know how that's spelled. Thanks for joining us again, Tobias. Hope you have a good night.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, guys. So real quick before we end the show, we'd like to thank Tobias again for coming on. We'd like to thank our listeners for everyone that appeared tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
We are going to be on next weekend, next Sunday at 7:00 p.m. We're going to be interviewing author Lisa Morton, and her book we're going to talk to her about is called Calling the Spirits, A History of Seances. So this will be another great show. Tonight's show was pretty awesome. Tobias, of course, didn't let us down at all. Nope. He had some pretty good material here. What do you have to say, Tim? Do you have to say any goodbyes or any kind of news or anything real quick before we get going?
No, I just got to say he was a great guest to have on the show, and all the people that interacted. Thank you all tonight.
Yep, and one last thing I'd like to say before we go. Anyone that's not currently subscribing or liking our post, click like on our show. Check us out on Twitter at twitter.com/BFP. You can check us out on Facebook. We have our website, bigfootspad.com. Click that like button, click subscribe, and keep up with the show. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.